Okay, so this is my first talking at my camera video, so please forgive me if it's a little bit awkward. Today I'm going to talk about something that's come up a lot when I'm tabling at anime conventions or Comicons or that kind of nerdy convention market, and that's transitioning from selling your handmade stuff as an artist or a crafter exclusively at conventions, at tables, to moving into selling as well through some sort of online marketplace. Specifically, I'm going to talk about selling on Etsy because that's really the only online marketplace I've used substantially, so it's obviously the one I'm qualified to talk about. If you're not familiar with my work, I've had an active Etsy shop for a bit over 3 years now, and I've had somewhat over 1,800 sales. So I'm not the world's most successful Etsy user, but I'm meeting a lot of my personal goals, which is making this into a part-time job and a source of income, and it's definitely been growing every year, so I'm hopefully doing something right. This video isn't going to cover a lot of the Etsy basics. I feel there's a lot of other really good tutorials on things like search engine optimization and photographing your products and that kind of stuff, so I'm not going to try and cover all of that. I'm specifically going to be talking about what sort of things to think about when you're transitioning from an Artist Alley marketplace into Etsy as an online marketplace, and hopefully how to be successful in doing that. So if you're currently selling at conventions, or you think you might want to in the near future, or even if you're just kind of a nerdy crafter and you're looking to just get into an online marketplace, hopefully this will be somewhat useful for you. So yeah, let's get going. I'm going to try and cover 6 tips. Okay, so tip number 1 is kind of the harsh tip, which is that not every product is going to sell well on Etsy. There are certain categories that are just either not searched for very often, or that are just very oversaturated with a lot of people who are very good at making them, where in order to be successful in those categories, you're really going to have to play a very long game of establishing a brand before you're going to get any sales at all. Before I started my current line of products, which are working quite well, I had 2 previous attempts to open an Etsy shop, and both times I was selling jewelry. And there was nothing wrong with the jewelry I was making. It's pretty good. I'm actually wearing earrings I made myself now, and these are like 10 years old and they're still holding up. My friends like them, I like them, they were fairly reasonably priced. They were good, but there were a lot of other good jewelry makers out there, and I just wasn't able to compete. I got some interest, I got a few likes, I got I think 1 or 2 sales, but it was not enough to start turning into something that was a part-time job or really a serious income source. So if you're making something where that's the case, you kind of got 2 choices. You can either look for something else to make that you're also good at that might sell better, and I'll talk about that a little bit more in the next tip, or you can try and invest and play the long game and plan to be spending the next couple of years establishing yourself in the market before you're really going to be making it into any sort of job. That's kind of what I did with my line of posters. I found that prints, when I was listing them, weren't really selling, and for a while I was considering just cutting them out of my shop and only selling them at conventions, but I decided I would keep at it and invest in relisting them and relisting them, and after they were up for probably at least a year, they finally started selling. People had found them, people had favorited them, people had shown them to friends, and people were finding my shop through the other things I sell, and they were eventually deciding to buy my prints. So it's certainly not impossible, but do keep in mind that what you're choosing to sell is going to have a serious impact on how well it's going to do. Completely independent of how good it is, it's just going to be what it is. Okay, so tip number 2 is you have to understand how people are shopping on Etsy. This is tied into sort of what products will sell, because the environment you're selling them in really does make a huge difference. At conventions or artist alleys, people are shopping in person, so you can attract them with flashy posters, you can attract them with your personal level of service, your customer service skills, you can attract them with your shop display and all that kind of stuff. On Etsy, those things can make some difference once the customers are in your shop, so having a professional banner and good photographs and everything will make a difference, but most people are going to be finding your stuff through the Etsy search function. The Etsy search function will be your very best friend if you're using it right. It will get you so much traffic because there are so many people who are visiting Etsy every day, and they're looking to buy stuff. That's why they're on a shopping site. And if you know how to direct them to your shop, then all of your Etsy fees, like the listing fee you're paying and the percentage of each sale you're paying, are going to be so worthwhile because Etsy will be bringing in enough traffic to pay for them, and then some. The trick is you do need to know what kinds of things people are going to be searching for. I've found that people are using the search function to meet some sort of need in their life. It could be an object they want, it could be a gift they're trying to buy, it could be a fandom in particular that they're trying to show off, but they've got something in mind already that they'd like to find before they're starting to type things in the search engine. So when you're taking your products from what you're selling at a convention, where you can kind of do anything that'll look cool, people will sort of find needs for it. When you're listing your products on Etsy, you should start with a need and then kind of match that to one of your products yourself. So if you've got a piece of fan art with two characters who are best friends in the show, maybe you could position that as a cool gift someone could get for their best friend. Or if you're doing art for, say, a children's show, maybe that would be something people would want to buy for their kids' room. You can also change up what you're doing, so you could take your art that you're just selling as prints, and maybe it could become postcards people could send to their friends, or it could become gift tags, or it could become downloadable images people could turn into scrapbook paper, or all sorts of other things. There's a lot of different needs people have that they want to meet on Etsy, from gifts, from home decor, from wedding favors are a huge popular thing. People want commissions or custom artwork that they can use to show off their fandom when they're getting married, to apparel. There are lots of options and lots of needs, and you can start with things that you'd be interested in buying and kind of work from there. So there's a lot of ways to fit your existing art needs, and there's also a lot of ways to think up sort of niches, things that you'd really like to see that you'd be able to make, figure out why you need them, and then make them for yourself, and if they're working out for you, you can also make them for others. And that's a good way to kind of work that back into your art process. So yeah, once you know what your customer is searching for, you can get into things like search engine optimization, but until you know what kind of niche your product is going to fill, then there's not really any point in, no matter how many search terms you put in, if no one's searching for them, there's not going to be any point. So yeah, understand how people are shopping on Etsy and use that to your advantage in order to help them find your stuff. Okay, tip number 3 is going to be another scary one, and that's that you should start to think about shipping. Not the fun kind of shipping, but the kind that involves the postal system. This is probably the issue that's scared away the most people I've talked to at conventions from opening their own Etsy shop, and I do promise it's not quite as scary as it sounds. What I usually do when I've got a new product that's going to be in a different weight class from anything else I'm selling is I actually just bundle it up the way I'm going to be shipping it, take it to my post office and ask them to weigh it in for me because I don't own a scale, and ask them to tell me the price. They will think you're a little weird the first time you do it, but eventually they will know you by name and it won't be a problem. I promise. Because you're going to have to ship everything you're selling on Etsy, that is something that you want to consider when you're trying to develop the product lines you're going to bother to list. There's some things that are con favorites that I've found personally can be really difficult sells when you're going into an online environment. Probably the best example I can find is buttons. Selling an individual button or two is great at conventions because they're small, they're cheap, you can just walk away with them. but when you're going into an online marketplace, selling a single button to someone, they're going to be paying probably more in shipping than they're actually paying for the button. So you've got to consider whether there's going to be a large number of customers willing to do that, and if the shipping cost is a huge percentage of the item's cost, then the answer is usually going to be no. So a general good rule of thumb is that cheap items should have cheap shipping. Expensive items can have expensive shipping, because if you're paying $200 for an item, then $20 in shipping seems a lot less expensive than if you're paying $10 for the item. But if you've got a cheap item and you're going to have expensive shipping on it, you should look into some new way to offer that item that's either going to make the item more expensive, it's going to have more value, or that's going to make the shipping a lot cheaper, usually by making the item either flatter or lighter. For Etsy specifically, you get to assign shipping profiles and shipping costs. Some people prefer to incorporate some or all of their shipping costs into their item's price. I personally don't like to, and the reason I don't is because Etsy actually has a slightly different fee structure for shipping charges versus regular charges, so they won't take away a percentage of the shipping charges you're charging your customers, so you get all of that money, so you can then spend it on postage and envelopes. So I like to use that savings and then be able to kind of pass that on to my customers. I've heard some people do have success by kind of blending some of their shipping charges into their item cost, but it's something I've personally chosen not to do. But that could be something that you might want to keep in mind if you're having an item that is otherwise going to look like the shipping is going to be 2 or 3 times the cost of the item. So yeah, do consider shipping charges when you're designing your products or deciding which of your products to list on Etsy, and do start thinking about ways to offer either more expensive, more valuable items if your shipping charges have to be expensive, or look into ways to sell items that are going to be very inexpensive for you to ship. And your post office is your friend, they will definitely help you out. So you don't need to go investing in like the $300 postal scale before you open an Etsy shop. Just use your post office. Okay, my next tip is to consider pricing your art according to the market you're in. A lot of the time when you're tabling at a comic convention, or especially an artist alley for an anime convention, your general market is going to be fairly young, and they're often going to be fairly budget conscious. If you're in high school or university and you're going to a convention, you've probably got a limited budget and you're probably interested in getting the most you can out of the dollars you brought. On Etsy, the average shopper is a little bit different. They're often particularly interested in handmade, they're often a little bit older, and because they're both more financially secure and they are specifically looking for handmade things, so they understand there's value in that, they're often willing to pay a little bit more. So the two different markets can often mean you've got to have two very different pricing strategies. Another thing to consider when you're pricing on Etsy is the idea of perceived value. If you're a very budget conscious shopper and you're at a convention and holding something in person and you see it's very inexpensive, then you might feel like you've just got a great deal. Whereas if you're someone interested in higher end handmade goods and you're seeing something that's priced very low, especially if you're only seeing it in photographs, your first thought might be more along the lines of, what's wrong with it? Why is it so cheap? So I'm not saying that you should never have inexpensive items on Etsy, especially because most of the items in my shop are actually quite small, but it's definitely worth considering that you are getting into a market where there are people who are more financially secure and who might be willing to pay more than you're used to. So while you're considering a product line for your shop, do look into ways to offer more value for people who have more money to spend. And I find that that can often pay off quite a bit. On Etsy, you can still price too high, but because of this perceived value thing, you can price too low. So I definitely recommend looking into other people on Etsy who are offering similar items and take a look at the kind of price range that they're selling in, and specifically that they're selling in, not just that they're listing in. You want to be looking at stores that are actually moving their products, and then consider your online pricing as something within that sort of range. Okay, so tip number 5 is another sad tip, and that's be prepared for DMCA takedown notices. So basically, copyright takedown notices. If you're a convention artist, there is a very good chance that at least some of what you're selling is fan art, and you're probably used to going to conventions, and there may be some rules about what kinds of fan arts you can and can't sell. They may or may not actually be enforced in my personal experience, and on the off chance someone tells you to just stop carrying something, you can just take it down for that convention and you can probably bring it back the next convention and no one's going to care. On Etsy or any other online marketplace, on the other hand, companies can find your stuff if you're using any sorts of related search terms, and they can get it taken down quickly, easily, cheaply, and very permanently. On Etsy specifically, I believe they've got some sort of flag violation number system, so if you get too many DMCA requests, you will eventually get your shop shut down, especially if they're for items that you've already had a request for and then you've put it back up unchanged and they've had to take it down again. They definitely frown on that, and you will eventually get in trouble, and you will probably eventually get your shop completely shut down. So there's 2 ways you can prepare for this. Way the first, you can research in advance what companies think about fan art. Probably not officially, but what their actions have been. So there's certain companies, I'm not going to say Disney, but yeah, who are very, very strict about fan art. And they will do DMCAs, they will take down anything they see, often at conventions as well, but especially online. Whereas there's other companies, I found a lot of Japanese video game companies and some anime producers who are a lot less picky about fan art. They tend to be more along the lines of turning a blind eye to it, as long as you're not like trying to compete with them or making a huge living off of it. But in general, there are other companies that'll be a lot less likely to go and try and get your little handmade shop or little handmade listings taken down. The other thing you can do to prepare for this kind of stuff in the long term is incorporate at least some original artwork into your shop. I try and make at least every other thing I add to my shop something that's not at all drawing on fan art copyrighted material, and usually more like 2/3, especially as I've been growing. The reason for that is that now, even if every single piece of fan art in my shop is taken down tomorrow, I will still have a business because I will still have a bunch of original artwork that my customers can come back to and that already have likes and favorites and that kind of stuff. So adding original art means that your customers will start appreciating your stuff as well as just the fan stuff, and sort of safeguards your shop and your part-time business on the off chance someone comes down and asks you to take down all this fan art that you put out there. You don't need to do like a whole fancy original series. You don't need to start your own comic or create a whole story around your work. You can work in fanish spaces that are not copyrighted. So you could do sci-fi art or steampunk art or cool dragons or giant robots or a million other things that people will already recognize and have fanish connections to, but that aren't things that belong to some specific company. So yeah, keep in mind that DMCA takedown notices are very easy to give online. Plan for that when you're making new art to post it online. Stay away from Disney, I recommend. I mean, I'm not your mom, but consider it. And add your own original fan art to start building your own brand and your own support. Original art so people can be a fan of you as well as just the fandoms you represent. is to cross-promote your Etsy store and your convention appearances smartly. In an ideal world, the two types of businesses, showing at cons and selling online, will feed into each other. So people online will follow your social media from your shop and learn about your local appearances and go specifically for you. And then people who meet you in person will hear about your online shop and go and shop there in between events. In a less ideal world, you'll be at a convention and you'll hand someone your card and say, also check out my shop. And they'll say, oh, you've got an Etsy shop. Well, I can just always buy your stuff later. And then they won't buy anything there. They'll then promptly lose your card, and then they'll never think about you again. So you do have to make sure that you're giving your local customers, your in-person customers, some reason to buy there, because that's kind of one of the reasons people are successful at an artist alley, while also giving your in-person customers a chance to become online customers as well. So for me personally, I like to treat my conventions, my local appearances, as like sales events. So I offer special deals, I offer some products I don't offer online, things like individual buttons, which I just can't really ship conveniently. And I make sure that anytime I'm handing someone my card and explaining I also have an online store, that I'm mentioning these deals at the same time. So they know that they can go back and shop later, but there's also a really good reason for them to shop now. At the same time, you don't want your online customers to feel really cheated if they then come see you in person and realize they could have bought the same thing for like half the price. So do make sure that you're keeping a reasonable balance between playing to kind of both sides of your business. Despite the problems, I do definitely think it's worth branding the two of them, your store and your online appearances, or your offline appearances, in the same way. I do definitely get not a lot of individual sales from conventions, but sometimes follow through for things like larger commission pieces that are going to be a lot more expensive that people don't necessarily want to buy right on the spot, or other larger orders. So in my experience, the follow-through hasn't usually been a lot of small orders, but it's been a few big ones. So it's definitely been something that's been worthwhile to me. Another thing I keep in mind with cross-promoting is that my cards link to my personal website, which then links through to my Etsy shop, as opposed to linking to my Etsy shop directly. That way, my offline customers are being directed to a site that I personally control and that I can change in the future, as opposed to being linked directly to Etsy, which is something that I use and I love, but that's not something I own, so it might be something I stop loving later. So by having your own website, even if it's just like a blog account or something you can get for free, it gives you that extra level of being able to connect your in-person customers to whatever you want to use at the moment, and gives you a little bit more control over your shop in the future. So yeah, those were the 6 things I could think of. I really hope some of those tips were helpful. If you are seriously looking into starting an Etsy shop, I guess nerdy or otherwise, Etsy does have a referral program for sellers to refer new sellers, and I think if you use the referral link, then the referrer and the referee each get 40 free listings, which is nice. It gives you a chance to try out an Etsy shop without actually having to invest any money in it, which if you're a starving artist you might not have a lot to play around with. And it gives the person whose link you're using a little bit of an extra boost to list more things themselves for free, which usually saves them a bit of money. So I will put my link in the comments if you want to use me as your referrer, or if you have a friend or someone you've met at some local conventions who also runs an Etsy shop, do feel free to get in touch with them and help out a local artist instead. That's about it. I hope this was helpful, or at least interesting if you're not actually interested in opening an Etsy shop. If you're interested in my art, I will link my Etsy shop down below as well, and please feel free to subscribe or poke around and check out my other videos. Very best of luck if you do decide to open an Etsy shop. If you have any other questions, please feel free to leave them here or on one of my other videos, and I will try to get to them, either in another video if they're complicated or just responding to you. Yeah, so thank you so much for watching, and I hope I'll see you around.